The sky burned with strange colors as fire and smoke rose from the shattered city. The air was heavy with dust and the distant thud of artillery. Reed could barely keep his eyes open as he stumbled forward through the wreckage. His right side burned with pain where shrapnel had torn through his armor hours ago, but there was no time to think about himself. Every sound around him was a warning: the howl of alien weapons, the shouts of soldiers calling for aid, the rumble of buildings. Collapsing under the weight of the attack, he had been told to fall back to the extraction point. Command had made it clear that the city was lost, that anyone left behind was on their own. But as he limped through the broken streets, something pulled his attention away from the path to safety. It was faint, barely audible through the ringing in his ears, but it was there, a high, trembling cry. At first he thought it might be the wind through the ruins. Then it came again, sharper this time, the sound of fear that even war could not hide. Reed stopped, his boots crunching over shattered glass. He scanned the street ahead. The cry had come from somewhere to his left, a row of half-collapsed homes that leaned into each other like broken teeth. Against all reason, he turned and headed toward it. Every step sent a fresh wave of pain up his side, but his mind pushed it away. Orders were clear: get out. But his gut told him he could not walk away from that sound. A wall had caved in on one of the houses, creating a jagged opening into what had once been a living room. Reed moved closer, his rifle ready. The smell of smoke and scorched metal filled his lungs. Inside the ruin, dust drifted slowly through beams of light that cut down from holes in the roof. The cry came again, this time only a few meters away. He lowered himself into the wreckage, pushing aside pieces of wood and stone. His armor scraped against the debris as he forced a path. At last, under the shadow of a fallen ceiling beam, he found the source. A small alien child crouched there, pressed into a corner, their skin pale like moonlight and marked with faint glowing patterns along their cheeks. Their large eyes stared at him in terror, and they clutched a tattered piece of fabric as if it was the only thing keeping them safe. Reed froze for a moment. He had seen their kind before, though only in the mess halls of Allied bases, never like this. The child was no more than 6 years old in human terms, tiny and trembling, with dust in their hair and a streak of blood along one arm. They tried to push themselves back further when they saw him, a towering human soldier in battered armor, but there was nowhere left to go. He spoke in a low voice, knowing they would not understand the words but hoping the tone would carry some comfort. Slowly, he lowered his rifle and held up his free hand to show he meant no harm. The child's breathing was quick and shallow, but they did not run. Reed scanned the building. It would not stand much longer. The sound of distant gunfire grew louder, and a deep, shaking boom rattled the ground beneath him. He knew he had minutes at best before this place became another pile of rubble. He could not leave the child here. He knelt down, ignoring the sharp pull of pain in his side, and reached out. The child flinched, their glowing eyes darting from his hand to his face. He gave them a small nod, the kind he would give to a scared recruit before a dangerous run. Something in that gesture seemed to reach them. Slowly, hesitantly, they let go of the torn cloth and placed a small hand into his. Their skin was cool, their fingers thin and shaking. Without another thought, Reed scooped them up into his arms. The sudden weight made his wound flare with fresh agony, but he kept his grip firm. The child's arms wrapped around his neck, clutching tight as if they understood he was their only hope now. He moved quickly through the wreckage, pushing aside obstacles with his free hand, his ears straining for the sound of approaching enemies. The streets beyond were worse than before. Fires burned in open craters, and the air shimmered with heat. He could see the shadows of alien soldiers moving between buildings in the distance, their strange armor catching the light of the flames. Reed's instincts took over. He stayed low, moving from cover to cover, always keeping his body between the child and any danger. At one point, a group of enemy troops appeared at the far end of the street. He ducked behind a broken wall, his heart pounding. The child pressed their face into his shoulder, and he could feel their small frame trembling against him. When the patrol passed, Reed pushed forward again, his mind focused on the extraction point. It was still blocks away, and the path there was not clear. Every corner could hide an enemy, every shadow could hold a trap. But turning back was not an option. As they moved, the child made a soft sound, not the cry from before, but something different, almost like they were speaking. The words were strange to his ears, fluid and musical, but the tone was unmistakable. They were trying to thank him. Reed didn't respond in words, only tightened his hold on them and kept moving. Another explosion shook the ground, and debris rained down from the buildings. Reed shielded the child with his body, crouching low until the dust settled. His breathing grew heavier with each step, and his vision began to blur around the edges. But he forced his legs to keep moving. He had made a choice when he stepped into that ruined house, and he would see it through. The street ahead narrowed into a makeshift corridor between collapsed structures. He pushed into it, hoping it would lead to a safer route toward the extraction point. The child shifted slightly in his arms, glancing over his shoulder as if sensing danger. Reed followed their gaze and saw movement in the rubble behind them. They were not alone. Reed froze for a moment, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows in the rubble behind them. The narrow street felt even tighter now, the broken walls leaning in on either side as if trying to trap them. He shifted his weight, keeping the child close against him, and listened carefully. The movement came again, sharper this time. The scrape of boots against stone and the low metallic hum of alien weapons being powered up. His pulse quickened. The enemy was close, far closer than he wanted, and there was no telling how many of them were back there. He turned his focus forward. The corridor of debris stretched ahead, littered with chunks of masonry and twisted beams. At the far end, there was a faint glow of daylight spilling in from an open square. If he could make it through, there might be another path toward the extraction zone. But the sound of pursuit was growing louder. He could not linger here. He started forward, forcing his tired legs to move faster, his boots crunching through grit and dust. Each step sent pain tearing through his side, but he locked his jaw and pushed on. The child's arms were still wrapped tightly around his neck, their face pressed into his shoulder. He could feel their quick breaths against his armor. They were silent now, but their body trembled, and he knew they understood the danger. Halfway down the corridor, a shout rang out from behind them, not in a human voice, but the guttural, sharp-edged speech of the enemy. It was followed by the rapid clicking of boots and the hiss of energy weapons. Reed did not look back. He broke into a heavy run, weaving between piles of debris and low walls that had been pushed together by the blasts. The weight of the child made each stride harder, but he held them tighter and kept going. The open square came into view, and for a moment he thought they had made it. But as he reached the edge, a beam of bright energy slashed past his head and scorched a deep mark into the wall beside him. He ducked instantly, pulling the child down with him, and pressed his back against the cold stone. The beam had come from the far side of the square. They were surrounded. His mind raced. Staying in the open was death. He scanned the edges of the square, spotting a half-collapsed archway to the left. If he could reach it, there might be cover beyond. He took a breath, shifted the child's weight, and broke from the wall in a low sprint. More beams cracked through the air around him, burning through shattered masonry and filling the square with the smell of scorched stone. He reached the archway and threw himself behind it. The child clung to him, their eyes wide and unblinking now. He knew he could not stay here long, the enemy would close in from both sides. He peered through the rubble beyond the arch and spotted a narrow alley. It twisted out of sight almost immediately, which meant it could serve as a temporary escape. Without hesitation, he stepped through the debris and entered the alley, moving as quickly as his battered body would allow. The further they went, the quieter the gunfire became, but the pursuit had not stopped. Every so often, he heard the echo of alien voices in the streets behind them, sharp and angry. The alley led into a maze of ruined buildings, each one leaning against its neighbor as though sharing their last strength. Reed used every scrap of cover he could find, keeping low and listening carefully before each turn. The child seemed to sense the need for silence. They did not cry or speak, only clung to him and occasionally glanced back down the path they had come from. Once, when Reed paused to listen, the child reached up with a small hand and pointed toward a side passage. It was narrow, almost hidden by fallen beams, but it offered a quicker path through the ruins. Reed followed without question, trusting the instinct that the child had spent their short life navigating these streets. They passed through the side passage and emerged into another open area, this one filled with the wreckage of what had once been a market. Stalls lay overturned, their contents scattered and burned. Bright scraps of cloth fluttered in the warm wind like faded flags. The place was silent except for the distant rumble of battle and the faint creak of beams shifting. In the heat, Reed crossed quickly, keeping his eyes moving. His body screamed for rest, but there was no safe place to stop. The child's weight seemed heavier now, though he knew it was only his failing strength that made it so. He reached the far side of the market and found a staircase leading up into the remains of a building. The walls were partially gone, but the higher ground could give him a better view of the path ahead. He climbed slowly, one step at a time, his breathing growing ragged. At the top, he crouched beside a broken wall and looked out over the ruins. In the distance, beyond the tangled streets and blackened rooftops, he could see the glint of metal from the extraction point. Dropships hovered there, their engines sending up clouds of dust, soldiers and civilians moving in steady lines toward the ramps. Relief flickered in his chest, but it was quickly drowned by the knowledge that they were still several blocks away and deep in enemy territory. The child shifted in his arms and pointed again, this time toward a winding street that led in the general direction of the extraction zone. It was narrow and partially blocked, but it avoided the main roads where patrols were likely to be heavy. Reed gave a small nod and began the descent. Back on the ground, he took the street the child had shown him. The air was thick here, heavy with smoke and the faint metallic taste of energy weapon fire. Shadows moved in the haze, but each time he paused, they turned out to be nothing more than torn banners or loose sheets of metal swaying in the wind. The tension in his shoulders never eased, every step carrying the weight of the risk they were taking. The sound of the enemy had faded now, replaced by the low roar of the battle still raging toward the center of the city. That was both a blessing and a danger. It meant the pursuit might have turned away, but it also meant the front lines were shifting. If they moved too slowly, the fighting could sweep over this area again before they reached safety. Reed pushed on, his grip firm despite the numbness creeping into his fingers. The child's head rested against his shoulder now, their eyes half closed from exhaustion. He wondered how long they had been trapped in that building before he found them, how long they had listened to the sounds of their world being torn apart. The thought only hardened his resolve. At last, the narrow street opened into a wider road. From here, the extraction zone was visible again, closer now, though still separated by a final stretch of open ground. He could already see soldiers holding defensive positions, their weapons trained on the ruins. Somewhere in that crowd would be medics, and somewhere in the crowd would be safety. But just as he took his first step onto the open road, A sharp cry rang out from behind them, not the frightened voice of the child, but the call of the enemy. They had found him again. Reed turned sharply at the sound of the enemy cry. It cut through the heavy air like a blade, a call that carried both command and the promise of pursuit. He did not wait to see their shapes emerge from the smoke. His boots pounded against the broken road as he pushed forward, clutching the child tight against his chest. The extraction point was in sight now, framed by the gray haze and the faint shimmer of heat rising from the ground. It felt painfully close and yet impossibly far, every step pulling at the raw wound in his side and threatening to drag him to his knees. The child stirred in his arms and turned their head to look back. A flicker of fear passed over their pale face, and they pressed themselves closer to him. Reed could hear the rhythm of his own breathing, deep and uneven, louder than the distant gunfire. The enemy was not firing now, which meant they wanted to catch him alive. That thought chilled him more than any weapon fire would have. The road ahead opened into the final stretch before the extraction zone. It was a wide expanse, cleared of rubble by earlier evacuees, but it was also exposed, with no walls or ruins to hide behind. Allied soldiers stood at the far end, crouched behind makeshift barricades. Some of them shouted when they saw him, waving for him to run faster. He did not have the strength to answer, only the will to keep moving. As he stepped into the open ground, the enemy appeared at the far side behind him. Their armor glinted in the dim light, strange curved plates that caught the flames and reflected them in sharp bursts of color. They moved quickly, their weapons raised but not firing yet. Reed knew it was only a matter of seconds before they would realize he had no intention of stopping. He focused on the soldiers ahead, their voices growing clearer. The roar of engines above signaled that the dropships were preparing to lift off. If he was too slow, there would be no second chance. Each step was heavier than the last, and his vision swam. But he kept his head down and his feet moving. A sudden sharp sound cracked through the air, not the blast of a weapon, but the deep, commanding note of a horn. It echoed across the open ground and made the enemy hesitate for a moment. Reed glanced up in confusion, his breath ragged, and saw movement near the barricades. A tall figure was striding forward, their armor unlike any he had seen before. It was ceremonial, layered in gleaming plates marked with intricate designs, and it caught the light like molten silver. The figure moved with purpose, their long strides eating up the distance between them and Reed. When they reached him, he saw the pale markings on their face and the familiar glowing patterns along their skin. This was no soldier from his unit. This was one of the child's kind, the child's. Head lifted from his shoulder, their eyes widening. A sound escaped their lips, soft but filled with recognition and relief. Reed slowed, unsure if his legs could carry him further, and the tall figure came to a halt before him. They looked down at the child, their expression changing in an instant from cold determination to overwhelming emotion. It was the mother. She reached out, her hands trembling for the first time, and touched the child's face. The child reached back, small fingers curling around hers. A rapid exchange of words passed between them, a language Reed could not understand but whose meaning was clear from the tone. The child was safe now. The mother's gaze shifted to Reed then, and for a moment her eyes seemed to take in every detail. The torn armor, the dark stain spreading across his side, the exhaustion etched into his features, the way he still held her child as if he would never let go. Without a word, she stepped back and called out something loud and sharp. Allied soldiers moved forward, forming a protective line between them and the enemy who still lingered at the far end of the open ground. More dropship engines roared overhead, their shadows sweeping across the broken earth. Reed felt his knees begin to weaken, the strain of the run finally breaking through the last of his strength. The mother moved quickly, taking the child into her arms with surprising gentleness. But instead of turning away, she sank down on one knee in front of him. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, her head bowed. The sight caught him off guard. He had seen her kind before, and never once had he seen one kneel to a human. Her voice was low now, almost calm, as she spoke words he did not know. One of the human soldiers nearby stepped closer and quickly translated in a quiet tone. She was making a vow, one older than their written history. A promise bound by honor and blood. It was called the Life Pact. She swore that she and her people would protect Reed and his descendants for as long as they lived, that his name would be carried in their stories as one who had saved what could not be replaced. Reed blinked, unsure how to respond. He had not done this for any reward or honor, and yet he could feel the weight of her words pressing into the air around them. The translator finished speaking, and all eyes turned to him. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, little more than a whisper. He told her to just make sure the child grew up safe. The mother's eyes softened at that, and she gave a single, slow nod. The soldiers around them began moving again, urging them toward the waiting dropships. The enemy was still out there, but the moment of danger had passed. The line of Allied troops pushed forward to hold the ground while civilians and the last of the wounded were loaded aboard. Reed walked the final distance with 2 soldiers at his side. His steps were uneven, the world swaying slightly, but the sight of the child safe in their mother's arms kept him going. The dropship loomed ahead, its ramp lowered, the warm glow from inside spilling out into the gray daylight. He climbed the ramp with help from one of the soldiers, feeling the hum of the engines beneath his feet. As he crossed into the hold, he turned one last time. The mother stood just beyond the ramp, her gaze fixed on him. She raised one hand in a gesture that might have been a salute or a farewell, and then she turned to shield her child from the dust. As the engines began to rise in pitch, the ramp closed slowly, cutting off the view of the battlefield. The noise of the engines filled the space, and the weight of exhaustion finally dragged Reed down into one of the seats. The medics were already moving toward him, but his eyes followed the memory of the mother's face and the promise she had made. Somewhere in the haze between waking and sleep, he understood that what had happened here would follow him for the rest of his life. The steady hum of engines was the first thing Reed heard when he opened his eyes. It was low and constant, a background sound that told him he was no longer on the battlefield. The sharp smell of antiseptic replaced the acrid scent of smoke, and the air was cool against his skin. He realized he was lying on a narrow bed with clean sheets, his body supported by a soft pressure beneath him. It took him a moment to understand he was in a medical ward aboard one of the Allied cruisers. The light above him was soft and dim, and for a moment he considered closing his eyes again, letting the quiet carry him back into sleep. But there was movement nearby, the sound of footsteps approaching, and his instincts pulled him fully awake. He turned his head and saw her standing there. The mother. She was no longer wearing the shining, ceremonial armor from the battlefield. Instead, she was dressed in a long dark robe that shimmered faintly when it caught the light. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried the same intense focus he had seen when she had first looked at him. In her arms, the child was sleeping, their small head resting against her shoulder, the faint glow of their skin soft under the ward's lighting. For a moment neither of them spoke. She seemed to be studying him, as if memorizing his face, and he simply watched her, unsure what she would say. When she finally did speak, her voice was low and steady. He did not understand the words, but a translator unit placed on the table beside him came to life, repeating her message in clear human speech. She told him she had stayed here since he was brought aboard, waiting for him to wake. She said the healers had worked to keep him alive, and that his recovery was proof of his strength. Reed shifted slightly, feeling the bandages wrapped tightly around his side. He asked about the child, though his voice was weak. The translator echoed his question, and the mother's lips curved in the smallest of smiles. She said the child was unhurt beyond a few scratches, that they had been frightened but were now safe. Then her expression grew serious. She stepped closer to his bed and spoke again, her tone firm but not unkind. The translator paused after each sentence, giving him the weight of every word. She told him of her people's tradition, the vow known as the Life Pact. It was older than their written language, passed down through generations by story and ceremony. A life pact could only be made when one life had been saved in a way that went beyond duty or alliance, when the act had been done at great personal cost without expectation of reward. When such a vow was made, it bound not only the one who spoke it but their entire family and descendants. It was an unbreakable promise of protection, loyalty, and honor, and it was rare beyond measure. In her lifetime she had seen it invoked only once, and never with a human. Reed listened in silence. The translator's mechanical voice could not carry the emotion in her words, but he could see it in her eyes. She spoke of how she had learned what he had done, how he had carried her child through the heart of the battle while bleeding from his own wounds, shielding them from every danger and refusing to abandon them even when ordered to retreat. She said this was not only courage but something deeper, something her people called the spirit of guardianship. She told him the life pact was now his, that her people would know his name and carry it in their stories. They would protect him, his children, and his children's children for as long as his line endured. She said her clan would answer any call he made, and that his enemies would be their enemies. Reed did not know how to respond to something so vast. He was a soldier. His world was orders, missions, and the men and women beside him in the field. This was something else entirely, something that reached far beyond the scope of one battle. He looked at the child sleeping peacefully in her arms and thought about the rubble, the fire, the sound of their small voice, thanking him even when they knew he could not understand. He had not done this for a reward. He had done it because walking away had never been an option in his mind. He told her that, his voice still rough from exhaustion. The translator repeated his words, and she inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. She said that was why the vow was worth making, but not everyone shared her view. Over the next days, Reed learned that the Life Pact had caused ripples through the ranks of both human and alien leadership. Some of her own people thought it too great an honor for a human, arguing that alliances were temporary and that such vows should be kept within their kind. Among the human officers, there were those who saw it as a potential source of political tension, fearing it would make Reed a target for enemies who wished to test the Pact's limits. The mother, however, met every challenge with the same calm certainty she had shown him in the ward. She attended briefings, stood before councils, and spoke with unwavering conviction that honor was earned by action, not species. She told them that this was not politics but truth, and truth did not bend to the comfort of those who feared it. Reed was kept in the ward while his body healed, but word of the Life Pact spread quickly. Soldiers he had never met came to see him, curious about the man who had earned such a vow. Some were skeptical, others respectful, but all of them understood that something rare had happened. Through it all, the mother and child visited daily. Sometimes she would sit in silence while the child played quietly nearby, stacking small blocks from the ward's supplies. Other times she would speak of her world, painting pictures of mountains that rose above the clouds and seas that glowed with light at night. Reed would listen, finding a strange comfort in the sound of her voice, even when the translator could not keep up with her words. One evening, as the cruiser drifted in the safety of Allied space, she told him that her people believed bonds forged in blood were unbreakable. She said that on the day of the battle, he had carried not just her child, but the hope of her family's future. That was why the Life Pact was not a gift but a truth, one that would follow them both until the end of their days. Reed thought about that long after she left the ward that night. He had been in battles before and had seen people come and go, their stories ending in silence. This was different. This was a story that would keep being told, one that would outlive them all. The days on the cruiser became weeks, and the weeks became months. The war that had once raged without pause began to slow, its sharp edges worn down by negotiations and a growing push for peace. Reed's injury healed, though the scar remained, a dark reminder of the day he had carried a life through fire and ruin. The life pact, once a private vow between himself and the alien mother, had become a story told in mess halls, on station docks, and across military channels. It spread not because of politics, but because it touched something in those who heard it. Soldiers and civilians alike found in it a reason to believe that trust between species could be more than strategy. It could be real. When the peace talks were announced, Reed was surprised to find his name on the list of those invited. The Allied leadership said it was a symbolic choice, a way of showing unity, but he suspected the mother had insisted on it. The talks were to be held on neutral ground, a station built between human and alien space, its great halls designed to host voices from many worlds. He arrived wearing a simple uniform, the same one he had worn on his first mission, its fabric neatly pressed but showing the wear of service. Around him, the halls shimmered with banners from both peoples, their colors and symbols displayed side by side. He saw alien leaders in robes that glowed faintly under the lights, human officers in crisp dress uniforms, and civilians from both sides moving among them with cautious curiosity. At the center of the hall, standing beneath the shared banners, was the mother. She wore ceremonial armor once more, polished until it gleamed, and beside her stood the child. They had grown a little since the day of the battle, their face fuller, their eyes brighter, but they still carried that same quiet watchfulness. When they saw Reed, they broke into a small run, their soft steps quick across the polished floor. They stopped just in front of him and spoke in halting human words. "You came." The sound of their voice and his language caught him off guard, and he found himself smiling. He knelt to meet their gaze and told them that of course he had come. The child's small hand reached for his, and they held it tightly as if making sure he was real. The mother stepped forward and greeted him with the same formal nod she had given in the medical ward, though her eyes held more warmth now. She said her people had not forgotten their promise, and that today they would make it known to all. He followed them toward the center of the hall, where a crowd had gathered to watch. When the moment came, the mother stood before the assembly and spoke of the day she had found her child in his arms. She described the journey he had taken through enemy lines, the wounds he had suffered, and the choice he had made to protect her child without hesitation. Her words carried the weight of truth, and the hall fell silent as she declared again. The life pact, this time for all to hear. She spoke of how bonds made in blood and fire were stronger than those made in comfort, and how her people would honor that bond for generations. The human leaders listened closely, some nodding, some simply watching, but none interrupting. When she finished, she turned to Reed and asked if he would accept the vow once more in front of both peoples. He thought of the child, of the rubble and the smoke, of the feeling when he had first lifted them from the ruins. He said yes, and his voice was steady. The declaration became the turning point of the peace talks. The image of a human soldier and an alien leader standing together with a child between them spread across both worlds. It was shown on news channels, replayed in reports, and discussed in quiet rooms where policy was made. For many, it became proof that the war could end not in bitterness, but in something better. Months later, long after the treaties were signed, the mother and child came to Earth. The visit was not political, it was personal. They stayed in a small city near the coast, far from the noise of the capital. Reed met them there, walking with them along the shoreline where the waves rolled in gently under a pale sky. The child laughed when the water touched their feet, their glowing skin reflecting the sunlight in soft ripples. They spoke more human words now, telling him about their home, about the mountains and the glowing seas their mother had described before. He listened, letting their voice wash over him like the sound of the tide. The mother walked beside them, her armor left behind in favor of simple travel clothes, though she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the water turned to gold, the child ran ahead to gather shells from the sand. Reed and the mother stood watching them. She said that in her language, there was a word that meant to carry more than life, to carry the future. She said that was what he had done, and that the life pact was not only for the past but for the days still to come. Reed did not answer. Right away, he watched the child lift a shell to the light, turning it in their hands with wonder, and he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The war was behind them now, but the bond remained, stronger than the steel of any weapon. It was not just a vow between two people, but a bridge between two worlds. When it was time for them to leave, the farewell was not heavy. They knew they would see each other again. The child hugged him tightly, their small arms around his neck, and whispered that they would come back soon. The mother gave him the same nod she always had, but this time it felt like more a silent acknowledgement that what had been forged in the fire of war had not only survived, but grown as their ship lifted into the sky. Reed stood watching until it was only a faint glimmer against the clouds. The sea rolled on at his back, and the wind carried the distant cry of seabirds. He thought about how strange it was that in the midst of destruction, he had found something worth carrying for the rest of his life. The scar on his side would fade with time, but the memory would not. Somewhere out there, in a world far from his own, a family carried his name in their stories. And here, on the quiet shore of his home, he carried theirs in his heart. It was not the end of the story. It was simply the place where peace began, the end